Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
I've paid their mortgage every single month for the last 12 years. And I'm not talking about some token gesture or temporary assistance during a rough patch. I mean the full payment, on time, every month, without them even having to ask. Without so much as a reminder, while my own name remained nowhere near the deed, the mailbox, or the insurance documents. And year after year, when my birthday came around, they somehow forgot. It wasn't that they didn't know, it was that they didn't care enough to try. No card, no flowers, not even a text in the group chat we never use, unless someone needs something from me. And every time, I told myself not to expect anything. I told myself I was too old for birthday expectations. But this time, it hit different. I turned 39 this year. Not a milestone, not some dramatic age, just a quiet, odd number nestled between the "you've still got time" 30s and the "you should really know better" 40s. I worked all day like usual, didn't plan anything special because I've been through this before, thinking that maybe they'll surprise me. Maybe someone in the family will remember and I'll walk into a voicemail or even just a lazy last-minute Facebook message. But the hours passed, and the silence stretched long, tight, and familiar. My coworkers bought me cupcakes and sang out of tune in the break room while I forced a smile and joked about hating attention, though the truth was, I'd kill for someone in my own family to make even that much effort. I checked my phone more than I'd like to admit. I even turned notifications off and back on again, just in case something glitched. Nothing. Not my mom, who sends Bible verses daily about grace and gratitude. Not my dad, who seems to remember the birthdays of every minor league baseball player, but can't manage to recall the date he brought me home from the hospital. And not Rachel. Oh, Rachel. My sister is the kind of woman who could crash your car and convince you to thank her for the ride. She has this way of spinning chaos into charm, always showing up late and empty-handed, but somehow leaving with the most attention, the best slice of cake, the warmest seat at the table. She's beautiful, reckless, and absolutely worshipped by our parents. It's been like that since we were kids. I was the one who packed lunches for school, who learned how to heat up soup when our mom had her migraines, who sat quietly in the waiting room while Rachel screamed bloody murder during dentist appointments. I was the built-in babysitter, the backup plan, the dependable one, and she was the dreamer, the delicate one, the one they never wanted to burden. And 2 weeks after my birthday came and went like a ghost in the wind, I opened Instagram, and there it was. A photo, high-res, filtered, and glowing with family pride, of Rachel standing in front of a brand new red Lexus. Her hair was blown out like she'd just stepped out of a commercial, and she was holding a giant novelty key with a bow wrapped around it like she'd just won a game show. The caption, courtesy of our mother, read, "When you support your kids the way they deserve to be supported, they fly. We love you, baby girl." I read it 3 times. Then I closed the app and reopened it. I even checked the date to make sure I hadn't missed some context, or that it wasn't some old repost. But no, it was current. It was fresh. It was Rachel's fresh start, apparently, after she'd broken up with her latest boyfriend and was rebuilding her life. And they'd bought her a car. A luxury car. From the same savings they'd once told me didn't exist when I asked for help during a medical bill issue a few years back. The same parents who had defaulted on their own car insurance until I stepped in. The same ones who called me panicked when the hot water heater broke and begged me to cover it just this once. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the photo, and something inside me didn't break exactly. It settled. It settled into this strange, sharp stillness, like the moment when water stops boiling and just simmers. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even text anyone about it. I just sat there, realizing that all these years I'd been carrying a weight they never acknowledged, like a donkey hauling gold up a mountain only to find that the people waiting at the top didn't think to offer a glass of water. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I opened the banking app. My finger hovered over the scheduled mortgage payment for the 15th of the month, and for the first time in over a decade, I tapped cancel. No explanation, No drama, just silence. The same kind of silence they'd given me every birthday for as long as I could remember. The next morning, I went to work like normal. I smiled at my coworkers, answered emails, refilled my coffee mug. But something had shifted, something irreversible, not loud, not theatrical, but final. And as I drove home that evening, I wondered, not if they would notice, but how long it would take. Because the truth is, when you pull the plug on a machine that's been running forever, it doesn't die with a bang. It sputters quietly, in confusion first. And I was finally ready to watch them sputter. It didn't happen all at once, which surprised me at first because I suppose I expected some kind of immediate reaction, some sudden flood of messages, or a panicked phone call the moment the payment failed to process. But the world kept turning as if nothing had shifted at all, as if the ground beneath them hadn't just been quietly removed by the very person who'd spent over a decade holding it up with both hands and a clenched jaw. They didn't notice, not right away, because people like my parents, and I say this not with cruelty but with something closer to resignation, are the kind of people who assume the lights will come on when they flip the switch, not because they paid the bill, but because that's just what lights do. For nearly 2 weeks, the silence continued, and I let it. I didn't reach out, didn't check in, didn't send a polite reminder or play the responsible daughter role I'd carved for myself. So long ago that I sometimes forgot I'd ever had another identity. I didn't ask how their week was going or whether they needed anything from the store, or if Dad had remembered to schedule his cholesterol panel. I simply let the silence breathe, and to my own surprise, I didn't miss them. What I missed, what I mourned really, was the version of myself who used to care whether they noticed I was missing. On the 13th day, my phone lit up at 8:42 a.m. with a call from my father, a call that would have once made my stomach tense reflexively, not from fear, but from the knowledge that it was almost never casual. I let it ring twice before answering, still sitting in bed with coffee in hand, already knowing what was coming, but curious how he'd spin it. His tone, initially light and vaguely cheerful, carried that strange practiced warmth he reserved for mechanics, realtors, and other people he wanted something from, but didn't want to admit it. He said good morning, asked if I was keeping warm this week, like we lived in the same town and not states apart, and then, with a shift in tone, so subtle it almost felt natural, he asked, "Hey, did something go wrong with the mortgage transfer? Just got a notice in the mail saying the bank didn't get this month's payment." I could have played dumb, I could have apologized, feigned a technical error, and offered to resolve it by end of day. That's what the old version of me would have done. Smoothed it over, absorbed the blame, restored the balance. But instead, I took a slow breath and said, as calmly as if I were ordering groceries, "No, it didn't go wrong. I canceled it." There was a pause, brief but full, and I imagined him standing in the kitchen, holding the phone a little tighter, processing what he'd just heard. He didn't ask why at first. He asked, "Did something happen?" And it was in that moment I realized he genuinely didn't know. Or maybe he just hadn't cared enough to put the pieces together, hadn't bothered to check the calendar or notice the absence of acknowledgement on a day I never asked them to celebrate, but always quietly hoped they would. I told him the truth. Not the dramatic truth, not the emotional explosion they might have expected, but the dry, even factual version that didn't let him twist it back into sentimentality. I said, "I figured with Rachel's new car and all, things were looking up for you guys. I assumed you didn't need my help anymore." Another pause. Then came the protest, defensive and clipped. "That was a gift, Ashley. A small gesture to help her get back on her feet. She's going through a lot." And there it was again, that reflexive centering of her experience, the immediate redirection of the narrative toward Rachel's hardships. As if my pain was always something to be folded into hers, compared against hers, and then dismissed entirely. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just said, 12 years isn't small, and ended the call before he could pivot or beg or guilt me back into the role I'd finally outgrown. That night, as I sat in my apartment eating takeout and watching some half-decent thriller on Netflix, a voice memo came in from my mother, She doesn't call, hasn't in years, unless Dad's in the hospital or Rachel's had a meltdown, so the voice memo was, I guess, her version of vulnerability. I listened once, then again, and though the words were carefully chosen to sound like concern and confusion, the undertone was unmistakably sharp. She said she was worried about me, said it wasn't like me to be so cold, said she hoped this wasn't some kind of punishment, which was rich, considering she hadn't texted me happy birthday in at least 7 years. I didn't reply. I went to bed early, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night without grinding my teeth. The next morning, my younger coworker, Natalie, asked if I was okay. She said I looked lighter. I told her I'd stopped doing something that had been weighing me down for years, and when she asked what it was, I said, being available. She laughed, not fully understanding, but I didn't explain further. Because it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about what the money represented. It was about the quiet expectation that I would give and give, unnoticed and unthanked, until I finally disappeared inside the very house I'd been keeping afloat. And now that I had stopped, I could finally hear the water rising. It didn't take long for the cracks to start showing, though in the beginning they came disguised as civility, polite inquiries masquerading as concern, careful wording that pretended to tread lightly while still reeking of manipulation, and that familiar tone in my mother's voice that always came out when she was preparing to remind me, in her passive but pointed way, that family didn't keep score, that love wasn't a transaction, and that I ought to talk through whatever this is, instead of making them feel abandoned. But the thing is, I hadn't abandoned anyone. I had simply stepped back from a table I'd been setting alone for over a decade, a table where I wasn't even offered a seat, let alone a thank you. And now that I wasn't refilling their plates, they were noticing the hunger they never acknowledged before. They kept calling, not constantly, but rhythmically, like they were trying to reestablish a routine they barely realized they'd broken. My father left voicemails he likely rehearsed, each one opening with stiff humor and ending with a hesitant suggestion that we clear the air. My mother, who had spent years avoiding direct confrontation, sent a carefully curated email with the subject line, "Just wanting to understand," in which she referred to my financial support as your kind help during those tougher years, as if we'd both woken up from some long dream where I hadn't been their unofficial bank and emotional backstop. She wrote about love, about the bonds between daughters and mothers, and about how sad it feels not to know what's going on in your heart anymore. But not once did she ask how I was. Not once did she reference my birthday. And not once did she say the words, "I'm sorry." Instead, she explained at length how Rachel was trying her best, how the car hadn't been new, but rather a certified pre-owned vehicle that they'd gotten at a steep discount through a neighbor, and how this gesture had been necessary because Rachel had been feeling so low lately, and they just wanted to lift her spirits. The part that got me, the line that stayed lodged in my chest like a shard of broken glass, was when she wrote, "We're older now, Ashley, and we've had to make hard decisions with the resources we have. Please don't hold a grudge over something that wasn't meant to hurt you." That sentence echoed in my head for days, not because it was malicious, but because it was so staggeringly blind. I hadn't held a grudge. I'd held the weight of their lives on my back piece by piece, bill by bill, until my own spine bent. And now that I'd finally let go, the silence between us was suddenly too loud for them to bear. What they didn't understand, and probably never would, is that my silence wasn't revenge. It was rest. It was recovery. It was the sound of me reassembling a version of myself that hadn't been allowed to exist in that family dynamic. I wasn't burning bridges for fun. I was just finally letting the flames that had always been there consume what should have crumbled long ago. Rachel reached out next, and it was every bit as awkward as I expected. She texted first, just one line that read, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. The next day she sent another message, this one longer and more emotionally chaotic, the way only Rachel could be when she felt cornered. She wrote that Mom and Dad were freaking out, that the mortgage company had started calling them directly, and that they were so scared they might lose the house. She said, "I know you're mad, but don't punish them like this." As if my absence was some tantrum, some emotional stunt meant to extract guilt or attention. And then, at the very bottom of her message, she added, "They're not like us. They can't handle stress the way we can. You know that." That sentence was supposed to bond us, I think, to remind me of the shared understanding between siblings who survived a complicated childhood. But all it did was highlight how little she knew me, how little she understood what it had cost to keep carrying people who refused to even notice the burden. I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I cared too long, too hard, and too quietly. In the meantime, I started to notice strange, beautiful shifts in my daily life. Without the burden of that monthly payment looming like a guillotine, my finances began to breathe again. I fixed my car's brakes after 3 months of riding on prayer and hope. I scheduled a long overdue dentist appointment, replaced the sagging mattress I'd kept out of guilt for spending on myself, and booked a small cabin in the mountains for a weekend in October. Just me, a pile of unread novels, and silence, the kind I chose, not the kind that stung. I even signed up for a pottery class, something I'd wanted to do since college, but never justified because it wasn't a priority. Turns out, joy doesn't need to be efficient to matter. At work, my colleagues commented on how relaxed I seemed, how much brighter I looked, and how my sarcasm had started to sound less bitter and more playful. I didn't explain. I didn't say, "I've stopped financing the people who never noticed they were being carried." I just nodded and changed the subject, because sometimes peace is too sacred to explain to those who haven't fought for it. Weeks passed. The messages from my parents shifted from confused to tense, then to sparse. The latest voicemail from my dad was clipped and formal, almost as if he were speaking to a stranger. "We'll handle it," he said. "We've been through worse, but you should have told us you were planning to pull out. That wasn't right." And that's when I knew they still didn't see it. They didn't see the years of effort. They didn't see the exhaustion. They didn't see me. They only saw what had gone missing from their accounts, not from their lives. So I let it burn. Not with malice, not with glee, but with the calm precision of someone who had finally, quietly, walked away from a fire she didn't start, and no longer felt obligated to extinguish. There was a point, not long after the third mortgage notice must have hit their mailbox, with its bold red lettering and polite but unmistakable threat of escalation, when I began to wonder if they would finally come to me not with excuses, not with rehearsed stories about why they did what they did or what Rachel was going through, but with something that resembled accountability, or maybe just the quiet, tired honesty of people who had realized they'd drained one well too many times and left it bone dry. But of course, that's not what happened. What happened instead was an invitation, an actual handwritten invitation, if you can believe it, folded carefully into a cream envelope and mailed to my apartment like we were starring in some outdated family drama. In my mother's looping cursive, was a request. They were hosting a family lunch on Saturday, just the 4 of us. They wanted to clear the air. And of course, they hoped I could make it. There was no mention of the money, no mention of the missed birthday, no apology, just lunch. Part of me thought about ignoring it, pretending it got lost or tossed with the junk mail. But curiosity, along with a small, stubborn part of me that still wanted to look my mother in the eye and see if there was anything real left in her gaze, dragged me back to that house. And I should say this, I didn't go to be cruel. I didn't go to gloat. I went to look the ghosts in the eye. It was almost jarring, stepping inside after nearly 8 months of distance, because everything looked exactly the same, down to the chipped ceramic soap dish in the hallway bathroom and the faint mildew smell near the laundry room they always insisted wasn't mold. It was like time hadn't passed for them. Not really. The house stood still in its patterns, in its familiar rhythms of dysfunction, while I had been learning what it meant to live without being in a constant state of readiness, without waiting for the next demand, the next guilt trip masquerading as affection. They greeted me with stiff smiles, my father's hug a little too quick and my mother's a little too long, like she was hoping proximity would make up for absence. Rachel, already seated at the kitchen island with a tumbler of iced tea and that same vacant smile she always used when the situation was delicate, barely looked up. She offered a quick, "Hey, you look great." But the words felt automatic, like they'd been copied and pasted from some manual on how to talk to sisters you don't really know anymore. The food was bland, and the conversation was worse. They talked about the weather, about gas prices, about how the neighbors down the street had finally sold their RV. I nodded, answered when spoken to, and waited. I waited through salad, through pot roast, through the second refill of iced tea. And finally, when dessert was being plated, store-bought lemon pie, which I hate, my father leaned back in his chair and said, with a forced casualness that made my teeth clench, "We know you've had a lot on your plate lately, and we wanted to say, we appreciate everything you've done over the years. We really do." That was it. That was the moment they thought would fix it. A single sentence, vague enough to avoid details, soft enough to sound like gratitude, hollow enough to avoid saying what needed to be said. I stared at my plate for a moment, then looked up at my mother, who was nodding along with a tight smile, like a publicist trying to sell an apology without admitting fault. And I said nothing, not yet. It wasn't until I stood up, smoothed the napkin on the table, and placed my untouched plate of pie back on the counter that I finally let them see the version of me they'd created, the version who had learned how to be posed in the presence of chaos, who had learned how to bury anger under a glassy calm until it became steel. "I'm not coming back to fix this," I said. "Not with money, not with fake forgiveness, not with pretending we're a family that talks about hard things." My mother's face fell, but she said nothing. My father opened his mouth, probably to protest, but I held up a hand and continued. "I've covered your mortgage for 12 years. I've answered every call, wired every emergency fund, canceled vacations, delayed car repairs, and said yes every single time, while you built a shrine around Rachel and told yourselves I didn't mind. And maybe I didn't, at first. Maybe I thought that was love, but it wasn't, it was debt. And I've paid it." Rachel finally spoke then, and I'll never forget the way her voice cracked. Not with guilt, but with embarrassment. "You didn't have to make it about the car," she said. "I didn't ask for it. They just offered. I didn't even know you'd be so..." "So what?" I asked. "So invisible? So used to being overlooked that it shouldn't hurt anymore?" She said nothing, and for the first time, I saw something behind her eyes that wasn't pride or charm or smug detachment. I saw discomfort, maybe even recognition. It didn't matter anymore. I turned to my parents, who both looked stunned in that particular way people do, when the person they've underestimated for years finally stops performing gratitude. "I want my name off everything," I said. "Emergency contacts, power of attorney, health forms. I don't want to be your plan B anymore. You have Rachel now. Let her soar." My mother made a strangled sound, some mix between protest and disbelief, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked out, my shoes echoing on the hallway tile, past the faded family portraits, past the thankless years, past the empty chair that used to be mine. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I drove in silence, windows down, letting the air slice through the quiet that had followed me out of that house. And when I got home, there was a voicemail already waiting, from Rachel. Her voice was tight, clipped, and controlled in the way people speak when they're pretending not to panic. "They're selling the car," she said. "They said they have no choice. And now they're asking about reverse mortgages. Are you really okay with this?" I didn't answer that message, because for the first time in my life, I honestly was. There's something strange that happens when you finally step away from a role you were never supposed to audition for in the first place, especially when that role has quietly shaped the entirety of your adult identity. When you've spent so many years being the emergency contact, the family accountant, the mediator, the backup plan, the "you're so strong" daughter whose strength wasn't admired but exploited, you begin to forget who you are when no one needs anything from you. When your value isn't measured by what you can do, or give or sacrifice. And in the sudden, unnervingly quiet weeks that followed my last visit to my parents' house, the visit that dismantled whatever fragile illusion of closeness we had been collectively pretending to maintain, I found myself sitting in front of my laptop most evenings, typing out messages I never intended to send. I didn't start writing them for closure, at least not consciously. It was more like muscle memory, the way a person might reach for a light switch in a room they've already left. One draft was addressed to my mother, and in it, I listed every time she had asked me to be the bigger person over the years, during family holidays, during fights with Rachel, during the time she forgot to pick me up from surgery because Rachel had called crying about a breakup. I wrote about how I never once heard her ask Rachel to be anything other than patient with herself. I wrote about how I had spent my 20s learning to swallow resentment like aspirin, and my 30s trying to unlearn the idea that love and usefulness were the same thing. In another draft, this one meant for Rachel, I tried to explain what it felt like to be the shadow sister, the reliable one, the boring one, the invisible scaffolding behind every family photo. I wrote about the time I got my first promotion, and no one called to say congratulations, how I learned to stop sharing good news because it always seemed to land like an inconvenience, something they felt obligated to acknowledge but never celebrate. I tried to make her understand that I didn't hate her, that I had even admired her once, her freedom, her boldness, her refusal to accept limits, but that I could no longer afford the emotional tax of being her safety net. And then there was the message to both of them, my parents, the one I almost sent, the one that lived longest in my drafts folder, the one that began with, "You only ever loved me in emergencies," and ended with, "Now that I'm no longer useful, I'm finally free." I deleted all of them eventually. Not out of forgiveness, not because I decided to rise above anything, but because I realized that they weren't for them, they were for me, and I didn't need them anymore. Saying the words out loud, even to a screen, was enough. They had served their purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with changing their minds or correcting the record. It had everything to do with reclaiming the version of myself that didn't need to be heard by them to exist. The silence stretched on, the calls stopped, the messages dried up. My mother, who had once texted daily about weather updates and scripture, fell completely silent after a single passive-aggressive message thanking me for making myself clear. Rachel disappeared from social media altogether. No more filtered brunch photos or captioned mirror selfies. The family group chat, which had never truly functioned as a place of connection, finally died its slow death, starved of obligation. And through it all, I found something I hadn't expected: peace. Not the warm, romantic kind that people write songs about, but the deep, bone-level peace of no longer waiting for something that was never coming. I stopped checking their profiles. I stopped wondering whether they were talking about me behind my back. I stopped imagining scenarios where they showed up at my door, contrite and transformed, ready to finally say what they should have said years ago. Instead, I started waking up with a kind of lightness I didn't recognize at first. I took longer walks. I listened to music without thinking about anyone else's preferences. I opened a savings account labeled Future House and put the exact amount I used to send them into it every month. I wasn't sure yet where that house would be or what it would look like, but I knew this: it would have my name on the deed and no one else's. When my next birthday came around, I didn't post anything about it. No stories, no countdowns, no attempts to telegraph my hope in the form of passive hints. I didn't send myself flowers to pretend they were from someone else. Didn't drop comments in conversations about how I didn't have plans yet, hoping someone would invite me somewhere out of pity or guilt. Instead, I booked a long weekend in a mountain cabin 2 hours north, packed 3 novels, a box of tea, and a wool blanket, and drove up in the early morning light with no itinerary except to be alone and undisturbed. That night, I sat on the deck, wrapped in that blanket, listening to the wind move through the trees like a conversation I didn't have to join. My phone, set to silent, lay untouched beside me. I knew they hadn't called. I didn't even check. Not because it didn't matter, but because I finally stopped expecting it to. And somewhere between the rustling leaves and the crackle of the small fire I'd built in the outdoor pit, I let go of the last thread that tied me to the idea that love must hurt to be real, that sacrifice must be endless to be noble, that family must be preserved no matter the cost. They skipped my birthday again, like always, but this time I didn't feel forgotten. I felt free.